Yes, when I agreed to do this, I thought, oh, this could be a piece of cake. I was wrong. I'm too short for this. I'm going to pull this over a little bit if you don't mind, because I can't reach. Okay, but what we decided we would do is, having done a little bit of research, and if anybody's interested in this topic, I strongly advise you to get this book, because pretty well everything I'm going to say, I got from this. Not every single thing, but almost everything. Also, the advantage of getting this book by Claire Belgrave, Theatre in the Bahamas, it stops at 1992. That's the drawback. But it covers not only Nassau, which I'm only focusing on Nassau because we had to cut something out. It also looks at the theatre tradition in Freeport and mentions theatre traditions in the rest of the Bahamas as well. It's really quite comprehensive. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give the sort of background. And Philip is going to speak from a lot of personal experience about the more recent years of theatre in Nassau, focused primarily around the Dundas. But we're not going to start there. I want to start with a quote that I really love about theatre. Theatre and democracy. Now, we can quibble with this a little bit, but let's have a look at it. If we take the words theatre and democracy, they were invented in the same place, in the same decade. When two actors on stage talk to each other, at that moment a different emotion is demanded from the audience. It's the emotion of empathy. The same emotion is required, that is required for theatre to work, is the emotion that is required for democracy to work. The idea that we need to care about each other's experience. And this is quoted by Oscar Eustis of the Public Theatre. This may seem like a name that has nothing to do with us, that you may not recognize. If you don't know what the Public Theatre is, it's one of the most respected independent theatres in New York, and it produces Shakespeare in the Park every year. That's probably what everybody knows it for. But Oscar Eustis is particularly important to Bahamian theatre because he was the dramaturg with whom Winston Saunders and Philip Burrows worked in San Francisco when they did You Can Lead a Horse to Water, and he's now leading the public. So theatre in the Bahamas, we're going to look at the first movement, but before I get there, I'll give you a little bit of background. It has a 300-year-old history, at least according to Claire Belgrave. She's looked and she's found accounts of theatre in the Bahamas back in the pirate ages. In 1724, there was Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Robbers and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, which mentions the performance of a skit in which a crew member was mockingly tried for piracy. And it was said to be a farce, a satire of the British system of justice. And this is found in Paul Aubrey's Story of the Bahamas. And Creighton notices that there is a play about Henry Avery, again during the pirate period, something called The Successful Pirate. Between 1823 and 1824, we have references made to theatre in the Bahamas by Adela Hart, who was a visitor to the shores of the Bahamas for about a year, and she spent a season in Nassau, and she saw plays there. In her book, Letters from the Bahama Islands, she mentions them. And then Belgrave also speculates that the Loyalists must have brought theatre with them. There's not necessarily any evidence that she could find of it, but she says that chances are pretty good that the Loyalists themselves brought theatre. And of course, there is the oral tradition and the African contribution to theatre, which probably has its most spectacular expression in Junkanoo, which is this coming together of all the theatrical styles in the public space. But you also have the oral tradition, storytelling, and in particular storytelling in the past would involve the whole person. The person who was telling the story would act out all the parts. And so this is part of the theatrical history. But something that she was able to find in the historical record, it's around the turn of just after the turn of the 20th century, about 100 years ago, in 1911. She notices in the Tribune, there are notices and letters sent from a variety of islands, Eleuthera, San Salvador, Exuma, Andros, Harbor Island, as well as New Providence, detailing the various programs, as they called them, that took place over the Christmas season. And these programs remained pretty standard. And I think most of us, certainly if we're over 35, we will remember some sort of program in a Sunday school, in a church, in a school or whatever, where you had the MC and you had the people standing up and learning and doing their recitations and some people telling a story or whatever. These things happened around and they were reported in the papers. So they're quite similar, and there's a lot of continuity there. But Belgrave contends that the beginning of organized theater in the Bahamas can be traced to the 1930s, and coincided, at least the recording of them coincided with the establishment of ZNS. On May 25th, 1938, Queen's Channel, which was a story centered around buried treasure in the Bahamas, written by Dr. F.G. Walton Smith, was performed on ZNS. And Dr. F.G. Walton Smith then founded the Little Theater, which produced theater on the stage. They did readings and performances, and this was the first recorded amateur dramatic group in the Bahamas. And they held play readings on Wednesday nights, and they began to stage plays for audiences in 1939. And the first stage play was performed at Victoria Hall on July 28, 1939, Nothing But the Truth by James Montgomery. The cast, there you go. Okay, the players. Marshall Brown, George Morley, John Ince, I don't know, Ince, thank you. Ralph Collins, Mrs. Kenneth Solomon, Gladys Aubrey, Dorothy Thompson, Emma Jacobson, Georgina Aubrey, and Rosemary Kelly. It was produced by Dr. F.G. Walton Smith, with a set design by William Castle. And at that, the acting governor read a letter from Lady Dundas. And the Little Theater, oh dear, I was supposed to mention this, but I think Ronnie will take over this. They also did, what was it, Ghost Train? Yes, at some point. I skipped that out. I didn't want to go into all the details, so I just put the first one in there. But she definitely records that. Basically, the great thing about Belgrave is she goes through all the papers, and she puts down every play that she finds recorded in the newspapers. It's a really valuable book. The Little Theater remained active through the 1940s. And this takes us into what Belgrave calls the second movement of theater. And so, as we all know, the Bahamas and Nassau in particular was segregated at that time. So you have these parallel theatrical movements going on. One in white Bahamian society, one in black Bahamian society. And the record of black Bahamian activity shows that schools and churches were the places where theater was happening. And the outstanding individuals would include Thelma Gibson at Weston Prep, and she was a frequent producer of concerts, or as some people would call it, the concert, attended by outstanding members of society, MPs sometimes, and also one of the most outstanding members of the theatrical community of that time, Mr. Hubert Farrington, who was currently dancing in New York City for the Met. Performers at that time included Joan Mason, Carolyn Hanna, Johnny Kemp, James and Peter Catlin. Also, we had Sadie Curtis at Sands School, Mother Donaldson on Meeting Street, Mrs. Una Henry and other Sunday school teachers. At St. Anne's, you had Father Henshaw producing plays. At Wesley Methodist, you had Reverend William Thackeray Makepeace. And the Wesley Society, we have the players, Corinne Patton, now Thompson, Emma Poitier, Timothy Gibson, Joseph Gibson, Matthew Sawyer, Eardley Moss, Harold Munnings, Marriott Poitier, Frederick Roberts. And at the same time, radio continues to be an important source of dramatic activity as well. Something else happened. It's not up there, but the Dundas Civic Center also became a place where plays were performed. And this is where the Ghost Train, I do have it here. The Ghost Train, which was originally performed as a radio play, it was staged on February 19th and 20th, 1942, by the Little Theater at the Dundas. And this would have happened, and when we get into the history of the Dundas, this would have been one of the first plays to happen in the Dundas, I imagine, after the incorporation of the Dundas and in the new building. But there was all kinds of activity that was taking place, and there's a record